Now, the New York Stock Exchange, together with Africa Investor, will once again host the market-leading annual CEO Institutional Investment Summit to profile leading African capital. Well, the summit allows for dialogue between African and international pension funds. And here to tell us a little bit more about the event, I should say, is the Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of Africa Investment. He's also very, very involved with something that's called the Sovereign Wealth Funds. And he'll tell us all about all that and more in just a moment. I'm joined by Hubert Danso. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Perhaps you can first speak to us about the origins of the CEO Africa Invest Summit.
Well, the AI, the Africa Investor CEO Institutional Investment Summit, was an initiative that we approached the New York Stock Exchange with because we both had a challenge. The challenge was that a number of the major US listed companies and institutional investors were not really allocating or getting enough exposure to the continent. So because we work with a lot of the institutional investors and the capital markets community in Africa, thought, let's see if we can create a platform in the US to bring the best of Wall Street and the long-term institutional investors together with Africa's capital market leaders. And about 7 years ago, we decided to host an annual event which essentially brought all of those key CEOs and decision makers and chief investment officers together to look at very specific capital market transactions and partnership opportunities. And we host that every year now on the fringes of the UN General Assembly in New York.
Most of the times when we see conferences or gatherings of this sort, your detractors would say this is just another talk shop, that there's very little fruit on the ground. Yes. We can't really feel the impact. Have you started to reap some of the rewards of those exchanges that you've seen between perhaps first world and third world nations?
Well, absolutely. They say you get out typically what you put in. Yeah. I mean, we don't see this as a conference. We see this as a very strategic alignment between global capital being catalyzed and leveraged by African capital. So the actual event itself is sidelined by the fact that there's multitude of one-on-one meetings taking place, partnerships being forged, transactions being presented by the leaders. So we have a number of companies that are coming to meet with institutional investors. Africa Investor Capital, the investment arm of our business, basically facilitates a number of one-on-one meetings. So it's very, very practical. It's not the sort of academic PowerPoint, spend all day just sort of talking about theories. There's very practical people with very practical and viable propositions, vetted propositions. And it's institutional investors that are not getting the growth that they need in North America and Europe because it's anemic growth there. And they're looking for the real growth that they see on the continent. And we're bringing the capital market leaders. So a number of the heads of the stock exchanges are there, the CEOs of the companies, key capital market regulators, African pension funds and sovereign wealth funds that are saying, let's co-invest. Let us de-risk these transactions for you at a local level. And you know what? We also have an allocation that's a global allocation. Let's see if we can reciprocate that and work together and build a partnership. And that's really what this platform is about, as distinct from a pure conference.
Pension funds and the administration thereof can sometimes be quite a contentious issue. But how do we fare here in South Africa, globally, and also I think within among our peers on the African continent?
Well, I think South Africa is obviously the largest pension funds market in the continent, particularly through GEPF. And I think the market globally recognises South Africa as very much a leader in many respects, a signatory to the UN PRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. It's taking a lead in a continental level by allocating probably the largest percentage for pan-African investments. Because, we have a big problem on the continent. If we focus on intra-African trade, 12 to 15%, very low. But then if you actually look at intra-African investment, it's a mere 5%, even lower. That means African pension funds, African institutions investing in other African countries is the lowest in the world. For example, compared to Europe, which was about 82% intra-European investment. So we see that as an opportunity, and these types of platforms bring, on a strategic level, African capital together to co-invest amongst itself to boost intra-African investment, but then say, how can we catalyze the $30+ trillion in the global institutional market to look at viable opportunities, viable capital market opportunities, in particular viable infrastructure investment opportunities that are regional in nature on the continent.
That's pretty interesting. I've always known that intra-Africa trade was problematic. I wasn't aware of intra-Africa investment, that there is an area that's untapped as well. But let's speak a bit more about the summit. I understand it's advocating for consensus-driven dialogue. First, define exactly what you mean by that and how you plan to achieve this.
Well, I think, you know, we've got to be practical. I mean, there's been a lot of Africa Rising stories and the macroeconomic justifications. Our sort of view is, let's not pat ourselves on the back yet. The work starts now. And on a practical level, if we want to mobilize investment, we need to give our partners sufficient comfort that those transactions have been de-risked. We have to look at how can we invest together. So co-investment is a growing global trend, but on the continent, we think that if we can get the co-investment strategies right and co-investment programs between African pension, sovereign wealth funds and other institutional investors, we can then open up a lot more capital to be allocated to the continent. However, we want to be able to use a Pan-African co-investment program amongst African pension and sovereign wealth funds. So we're building that dialogue to answer your question. Because then once we have that solidified, because, you know, a pension fund in Dallas, for example, always asks the question, why should we invest our retirees' money into Africa if your own pension funds are not doing the same? So we really want to create that platform with the policies in place, specifically a Pan-African co-investment program between pension and sovereign wealth funds, and then engage the global partners to come in and co-invest.
As a firm foundation upon which to build.
Absolutely, on a policy level and a practical transactions level. So we want people from the continent to say, these are the projects that we're going to invest in. Come and join us, and then vice versa.
We're doing the same as well.
Exactly.
Okay, as briefly as possible, because we are running out of time. I understand you'll be hosting the event at the New York Stock Exchange, but what I want to know from you, attendance has been restricted to institutional investors. Why have you done so?
Because, you know, typically the institutional investors, it's very rare that you find them congregating in one place. The reason that they don't seem to want to congregate in one place is because they're usually being approached typically by managers for a different style of business, which they tend to administer in a different format. We want to bring the real capital allocators to get that consensus without distractions, to really focus on what percentage of their portfolios they can allocate to Africa. We want to increase those allocations, and we want to take all the time during that day to facilitate partnerships and potential trips to the continent for them, and the building of those relationships.
So it's for practical reasons.
Very practical.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for having joined us.
Thank you.
The Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of Africa Investor, Hubert Danso. Thanks again for joining us. Now, when we come back, we'll have lots more for you. But before we